Jay, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Oh, happy to. My name's Aaron Simmons, and I teach philosophy at Furman University, which is in Greenville, South Carolina. And I know most of your guests immediately hop into their academic credentials, but I'll start differently. I'd rather be trout fishing than almost anything else in the world. Mountain biking has become my new love during COVID, and have gotten pretty serious, which means I've injured myself a couple times already. And I have a 13-year-old son, been married 21 years to my wife, Vanessa. And in addition to all of those fun things, was a professional drummer for a long time, but also studied philosophy for quite a while. And so I specialize in philosophy of religion from a broadly continental philosophy perspective, which to some people may make no sense at all. And I'd say, well, I think a lot about God and faith and identity after the death of God. And so post Nietzsche, post Kierkegaard, people like that. Have written a bunch of books, edited a bunch more. Do philosophy every chance I get, and excited to be here with you. I would encourage people, if they do enjoy our conversation, to check out my YouTube channel, which is simply called Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. So, yeah, man.
Awesome. That is a cool history. I love the professional drummer part. So if you happen to know any hot blondes, please send them my way, because I'd rather be with hot blondes than anything else.
Well, I'm not sure I can help with that. My wife is one, but she's taken. So
yeah. Also, have you done any of the double black diamond off-road biking
No.
yet?
I'm a fairly confident black diamond, but double black has way too much jumping for me. And at 45, I'm more comfortable on technical stuff than I am getting really high in the air, just because the crashes, tend to be a little bit more gnarly, and so I try to avoid that.
So. Yeah, I really like the ones that go through the forest and you have a 3-inch window between the trees while you're on an actual natural log. Those are hilarious.
And for some reason, we all want as wide a handlebar as we can get, because it gives us lots more stability. But then, I have 2 or 3 times clipped, a tree with the handlebar, and it kind of throws you over the other side. But for real mountain bikers who've been doing it for years, I'm still an amateur, but I live in an amazing part of the country. Here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm right next to DuPont State Forest, Pisgah National Forest, all these amazing places to ride. And so during COVID, I thought, well, shoot, if I have a year or two, I might as well do the stuff that I wish I had time to do. And so fished a lot, bought a new truck, and do a lot of off-roading and overlanding and camping and hiking. And so part of that just then got into mountain biking. And my sister's partner is a serious enduro rider. And so he's the one that got me into it. And now I've got a couple friends I've made who, again, are really good and really serious. And so they let me tag along. And, to their credit, they don't mock me too much for all the gear I wear trying to protect myself. So,
yeah, I put on hockey pads. I have hockey pad pants and the big dirt bike things that you wear on the pads for your chest, because I do that while rollerblading, because just even the slightest fall can put you out for weeks. So I'm no, I'm going full pads.
So long. I tore my AC joint back in December, and was at a bike shop recently and was saying something about had to recover. And you guys oh, you've got an AC bump too. And so all these dudes in the place start pulling their shoulders down to show it. All of us have the same bump now from our AC joints being ripped. So it's a strange thing to enjoy doing, but man, it's better than running is the way I look at it. So, and at 45, I'll do whatever I can to stay in shape. So. So I don't know. Can everybody else still hear me? It seems like Tom has frozen on my end. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe my side has frozen. Well, we'll see if he comes back on. Everybody doing well? Okay, good. I was hoping it wasn't me messing things up. So, all right, cool. Why use pads? I just have faith I won't crash. Faith and some evidence alongside sounds good to me, though, right? Hope you guys are rocking. So, yeah. No problem, Nico. Hope you guys are doing well today. So, yeah, like I said, whenever I talk about mountain biking, I feel like a poser because all the dudes I ride with are just so good. And I am not, but I'm making small progress, incremental steps, I guess, which actually connects to how I'm going to try to describe faithfulness. It's not about success. It's about being committed to becoming somebody who you want to have been, not about checking boxes, but, continuing to progress. So we'll see. Yes, Woody, the chair got him, sucked him in. Nihilism. 20 years of skateboarding. Yes. It turns out when you try to push your arms out and stop yourself, that's when really bad things happen. So I'm trying to learn to roll. My son's a skateboarder, so he's much better at crashing than I am because he just rolls around. Yeah, I am a fisherman. I love trout fishing. I've been trying to get into fly fishing during the pandemic, but I admit I'm not great at fly fishing. I have all the gear and sponsor the fly club here at my university, but I'm a much bigger fan of using ultralight spinning tackle, which I know annoys all of the purists. But yeah, love trout fishing. So in fact, one of the chapters in a new book I'm working on called Camping with Kierkegaard, one of the chapters is simply called Of God and Trout Fishing. So can I link my channel? I'm sure I can, though I'm not sure how to do it in here. Yeah, I don't know how to actually comment, Woody. It's Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves is the YouTube channel. I try to do, early in the pandemic, I was doing like daily videos, which was a lot to maintain, but a little bit less regular now.
All right, I am back.
Hey,
my internet died. Don't know what happened there.
No, you're good. We've been having a ball over here.
Awesome. So I'm just gonna leave and let you take it. I'll just come back in like an hour.
we had to bounce around. Like, is it me frozen or you? And I had a bunch of your viewers helping me out on that, so I appreciate their
input. Yeah, they are good at checking all the technical issues. So, but anyway, I am back. We talked about like dirt biking and stuff. And yeah. I do rollerblading. I got into rollerblading pretty big.
That's awesome. My son rollerblades and skateboards, and I'm trying to get him to do some mountain biking, but he keeps telling me that skateboarding and stuff, there's no rocks in the way when he does it.
Yeah,
I think probably a good point. But all my road biking friends, I see those as the people who are just absolutely insane. I mean, for me, I'll tackle a rock and a tree any day over a 16-year-old with a cell phone. So I'm way less scared of mountain biking.
So see, I tell my friends I do a marathon. I bike 26 miles every day, which is around the 3 or 4 lakes, and people are like, "Oh my God, that's so much! How can you even do that?" And then you go to like the biking meetups, just meetup.com, the old 60-year-old guys, they're rated at a minimum of like 20 miles per hour for a 50-mile trip, and that's like the B level. The A levels go 25, and they do 100 miles in a day. It's like, I'm on the old guy track here.
Yeah, it's crazy. I recently tried road biking for the first time. A buddy of mine was like, "Oh, you can borrow my bike, give it a shot." So I did a 30-mile ride and averaged 18.5 miles per hour the whole time, which I thought, was okay. And then, started looking and was like, man, this is awful. And then on top of it, for me, I realized that it was like, man, all of the work, but none of the adrenaline. So it's not a thing I'm going to do a lot of, but I recognize road bikers are elite athletes in ways that I will never be. It's just nuts to think about doing a century and then going to have brunch. It's unreal.
Yep. Well, anyway, so philosophy. The title this Faithfulness as a Way of Life.
Right.
What does that mean to you?
Yeah. So I tend to think that one of the problems when we talk about philosophy, especially philosophy of religion, is faith, of course, is one of those immediate catchwords, right? We talk about God and faith and belief and things like this, evil, morality. But faith tends to be something deployed as this, thing you have when you don't have good evidence. And so it tends to be contrasted in that sort of a way. Well, I would hold view X. I don't have enough evidence, but I still want to hold view X, so I will have faith. And I do think that's the way lots of people understand faith. And I think it's kind of a bullshitty sort of way to do it. And the reason is it either is going to lead to a really dangerous kind of insularity relative to our epistemic and cognitive lives. So we, go out of our way to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from obstacles to that faith, namely counter evidence, right? And so the kind of work you're doing and lots of my friends, professional philosophers are doing is trying to model what it looks like to take very seriously evidence-based argumentation as part of how we ground belief and how we then motivate action. So you might think, oh, well, then the goal, right, is to eliminate faith so far as possible. And I want to say, yeah, if by faith we meant, knowing things that ain't true, as Mark Twain or someone once said, right? So what started me thinking about rethinking faith was actually years and years ago. We have things happen and we don't realize that it made a big impact until much later. Well, for me, that happened when I was early in grad school. I had grown up a Pentecostal Christian. I still identify that way. Went to a Christian school for college. Then I landed at Florida State University. And by the way, I went there just because I'm a Seminoles fan and I wanted to watch football. So we won a national championship while I was a student. So, my life is complete, right? So I was there at Florida State and, I had been raised well. My parents are professors. So faith had always been in the context of Christian identity. It had always been something that was still, intellectually responsible, but it always still kind of meant that things that we have because it's not about evidence. And then I got to grad school and started reading this guy named Soren Kierkegaard, and it really kind of changed stuff. And what it did was invite me to rethink faith, not as this contrast to epistemic purity, but as a way of life, as a motivation in some sort of direction. And so Kierkegaard doesn't put it this way, but this is how I summarize Kierkegaard's thought and use it in my own writing. Faith is a risk with direction. So if we understand faith as risk with direction, then it's not in contrast, I think, to, epistemic certainty, right? Fallibilism is the contrast to that, and that seems utterly responsible, and we should be fallibilists. Certainty is dangerous in almost every area of life. Faith isn't in contrast to certainty. Faith is instead in contrast to a refusal to recognize risk as intrinsic to the human condition. And so the way that I've then thought this through is thinking about if faith is this risk with direction, faithfulness ends up being a fundamental orientation of one's existence in the direction that you think is meaning, that you think is meaningful, that you think is worthwhile. And so the question that faithfulness answers for me is the question all of us have to ask as humans, which is, what's worthy of my finitude? Now, notice, none of this has had any conversation or any reference to God talk, right? So what I'm trying to do in this work, in this sort of existential philosophical mode, is get us away from thinking as faith as a property of religious persons, and instead thinking about faithfulness as an orientation in contrast to what I would describe as the success modeled mindset of contemporary late market capitalism. So instead of thinking about checking boxes to achieve, we have all kinds of goals that we want to achieve, but those don't define us. Those are what I call being goals. But the real goals are becoming goals. So it's, who am I becoming? Am I okay with myself? Do I like the kind of person that I'm oriented toward becoming? And then this is something that doesn't stop, right? It's something that we keep doing and we transform and deepen and massage as we grow. So this all comes out of Kierkegaard's claim where he says faith is a task for a lifetime. And if we go back to the ancient Greeks, philosophy was a task for a lifetime. It was a way of living. It wasn't, hey, I got my PhD, so now I'm a philosopher. what's next, right? It was, no, I'm committed to truth and goodness and beauty the best I can. I'm going to spend my life doing that. And so if we think about faithfulness in this becoming way, then I think atheist, Christian, polytheist, Hindu, Baha'i, questioning, wherever we land on questions of what we call religion, I actually think we are all tempted by either a success mindset or a faithfulness mindset. And I'm trying to argue that faithfulness is actually a better model for finite beings like us.
So a few questions there. One would be, why would we use this alternative definition of faith? Because it seems like as we ambiguate it, the meaning goes away. The meaning leaves it. So like if faith is simply, I forget the risk in something else, risk and direction, something like
risk
that.
With direction. Yeah.
Risk with direction. That seems like pretty much synonymous with just induction and motivation. I don't see the value in the term anymore, because it just seems to be like you go based off of probability or game theory, the risk to reward analysis of what you're trying to gain, and you make the best guess you can dependent upon the amount of reward you're going to get based off of whatever kind of investment you're making. And
Maybe.
So it just seems like no different from just basic game theory induction. I don't see the value of the word anymore.
Yeah, I mean, so I would push back on the idea that risk is best thought of in an existential sense relative to game theoretic reward outcomes. So I would suggest that that's actually forcing faith back into a success model. So, for example, when I talk about faith, what I now would say is, all right, I want to become a good father to my son. Now, what that means is I don't have like a fathering win on a Tuesday at 3 p.m. and check the box and say, I did it. I've accomplished my goal. That's actually a horrible father, because then I could walk away and not continue to be invested in becoming a good father. I would say, along the lines of someone like Jacques Derrida, the only way that we are truly faithful is if we are constantly invested in becoming the thing that we hope to have been. So a good father, a good husband, a good friend, these aren't things that we run in a risk reward calculus. We instead think about them in terms of, all right, when my finitude is done, will the story that my life has now told be one that I think was worth writing? And in that sense, again, I'm always going to pull toward this existential mode, where Camus says, the only question is whether or not to kill yourself. And what he's really asking is, so why is it worth continuing to get out of bed? Why is it worth risking yourself in the direction of continued life? And I think
sorry, just to interrupt
we can do it
briefly. To me, I don't see how that is different from game theory, because game theory, the reward doesn't have a limitation. It can be anything. It can be having a life worth living, or having lived a life worth living, or having been a good father. And so all of those are still compatible with game theory. Game theory just says is whatever you consider the reward to be, what actions are you going to take in order to try to achieve whatever that happens to be. And so if your goal is to be a good father or whatever, and having lived an entire life as a good father, and that's your goal, and you're weighing that against some possibility that you could go wrong. So you do actions to try to move towards that goal, and you could accidentally lead to your child's death or something. So you go dirt biking with him, maybe he falls off and breaks his neck. And so there's that risk that you could end up being a bad father, because you lead him to something that would shorten his life. But you take action in that you're trying to be a good father and trying to limit that risk. And so you're trying to achieve your goal of being a good father, which is in the game theory, the reward. And you do that given that there is some risk that you could fail, or you're taking actions that could lead to the opposite of that, but you're doing it with the best intentions and the best statistical probabilities. So you're trying to maximize your chances of achieving the outcome that you desire, which is being a good father. So I don't see why any of that would be contradictory with game theory analysis.
Yeah. So again, if we want to play the language game of game theory, I think that there are ways to make that work. I just find the language game less compelling, because it always is going to talk about a what rather than a who and a how. So for Kierkegaard, a radical distinction between thinking about faith in the terms of, well, what then do I believe, versus a who am I trying to become? And so when Sartre at one point, kind of saying back to Kierkegaard, says, look, it's not just a matter of faith to become a Christian. It's also about faith to become an atheist. The goal there is not about having achieved. It's about the becoming, the praxis of becoming. And so that idea of becoming a self in relation to both our future, which is open-ended and uncertain, in relation to other beings who are themselves finite and, units of meaning making in their own right, all of that, I just would want to say, yeah, we can think about in terms of game theory. I just don't find that as a productive a conversation, because it forces us back still into, so what are these what lists, right? And so when I say, yeah, one of my whats is become a good father, but I'm not going to cash that out as a what that I want to achieve. I'd say it as, who am I trying to become? I am trying to become a good philosopher, trying to become a good father, trying to become a good friend, trying to become, a good champion of social justice and progressive causes in the world. All of those things, I think, can very easily reduce to, again, a matter of consumptive capitalistic articulation, where we end up saying, here are these goals. How do we achieve the goals? And then it basically turns what I would describe as faithfulness as a way of life, this Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean model of, heading to the mountains to think with Zarathustra. These then get reduced to motivational speeches offered in front of business audiences in order to make them continue to buy a particular product. That's what I'm just trying to interrupt. So that's why, for me, the opposite of faithfulness is success, not in the sense of, oh, so let's go be failures. I'm saying, no, let's get over the model that says success and failure is what determines our existence. I want to be successful in all kinds of ways. We should all try to be successful, but I don't want to be defined by that success, and I don't want to be wrecked by that failure. And in the attempt to try to think that through, that's kind of what I'm continuing to find. Well, look, when Mother Teresa says the goal is faithfulness, not success, when Martin Luther King says, it's okay if I don't get to the mountaintop with you because I've already been there, because I've lived my life in a way that matters. And he says, don't tell them about my Nobel Prizes. Tell them I was a drum major. These types of people model, I think, what it looks like to be ever more committed to trying to be the type of person that we think finitude demands of us.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the statement that the relativist, when the relativist says there are no ultimate truths, and you ask them, well, is that an ultimate truth? Mm-hmm. It seems like when you're describing things that you say we shouldn't define this in terms of success, well, if you do that, are you being more successful at your model? So it seems like success and failure are more clear, easy to understand primitives for humans to grasp mentally. Like a few people in the audience are saying they're confused. They don't really follow the point. And so I would agree. I would say that trying to adopt that linguistic model to express motivation, I don't see the benefit in it. It just seems to be harder for people to understand. The reason we use this success failure model is because it's very easy. And it seems like what makes a language a better way to express things is how easy it is for people to understand. And so a lot of the people you mentioned, Sartre, Derrida, Foucault, all those kinds of groups seem to go the other way. They seem to make things less easy to understand for most people.
Right.
And so I'm wondering what the benefit of adopting this linguistic model is in the face of the fact it makes things more confusing for people. It makes it harder for them to understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, so I think there's nothing to be gained from opacity for its own sake. I often have my students have to symbolize Derrida's arguments, which it turns out is a nearly impossible task. And the whole point is to try to get them in their own thinking, to say, look, how can I be clear? How can I be lucid?
Symbolize as in syllable, like make it into a syllabalism?
Yeah,
Or
like in
symbolize...
using the tools of formal logic. Let's say like difference, and let's translate this now into existential and universal quantifiers and run predicate logic and actually make what he's saying into propositional form, right? Stupid hard assignment. But the point is, there's no benefit in opacity just for its own sake. There is benefit in challenging what has come to be seen as an easy mode or a binary way of thinking, when that very binary or that disjunction itself serves to trap us into the ideological constraints that are benefiting a power structure we oppose. So one of the things I worry about with success and failure is what we then name success and what we name failure. So we name in America success in ways that tends to look all too white, male, Christian, heterosexual, wealthy. And we tend to name failure those people and those bodies who tend not to reflect that narrative of a life worth living. So when Socrates says he's trying to figure out a life worth living, his goal is examination, not, public personas that are going to gain popularity. So I'm with you on the idea of this requires us to rethink some of these terms because they can be trigger words. Faith is triggering for a lot of people because it can then communicate religious trauma. But success can be triggering, I think, for a lot of people insofar as my highly motivated, highly quote unquote successful students at a very elite university increasingly are struggling with all kinds of realities that I think are attributable to the idea that we've told them, here's a life worth living. And it looks like this market-driven model of success. And so when we say to them, hey, who are you becoming? What matters to you in life? That question is a question often they've never even had a chance to ask because they've never been asked, what does it mean to be faithful in your life? To what? What are you giving your life toward? What's the direction of your risk? We instead have said, what's your major? What are you going to do with that? How are you going to make money? These are all important questions. So again, mine is not get rid of success. It's let's just intervene in this narrative that I think is leading to absolute despair, not only among people who are trying to figure out who they are, but also among people who then are facing midlife crises because they've either succeeded in all the ways they set out to do and now say, what the hell am I supposed to do? Or those who quote unquote failed and then now feel like, well, their life is not worth living. So all of this for me is fundamentally existential philosophy. It's just doing what the existentialists got right, which is how do we think well about the realities of human freedom in light of human finitude? And in order to do that, I don't think our current capitalist model of success and failure is all that productive. I do think inviting them to think faithfulness as a way of life and then investing themselves in a particular direction, whatever they do for a living, however they understand their career, right? That seems productive to me.
To me, it seems like the natural ambiguity of language. Don't you think that if we started with that language usage, that instead of success as a measurement of purpose in life, we use goal-drivenness and meaningfulness, I would believe that over time, the same kind of emotional biases would become attached to meaningfulness that we have attached to success, because success is ambiguous. It doesn't say what success is. Maybe being a rock, like I have autism, people with autism have special interests, and there's people whose special interest is rocks, and so they really like rocks, and so
my son's a huge fan, has a huge collection of them. Yeah.
So success for someone who's autistic can look completely different from what a normal person in society would think of as success. And so the word success doesn't have any entailments about capitalistic society and jobs and monetary values. That's something that we've added to them because of social conditioning. And it seems like if we used your language, say 300 years ago before capitalism really took off, the same kind of emotional biases would become baked into meaningfulness that we currently have baked into success. And so the only advantage of using the meaningfulness language seems to be the fact that we don't have any of the same biases that are baked into it yet. But I don't really see any other advantage there, because we could simply just use success in a more vague way to be each individual finding the most meaning in their life could be what we define as success. And the
Yeah.
reason we don't is because of what happens to be beneficial to survival. So the one thing I would definitely disagree with you on is I don't think capitalism is bad. I think it's kind of like democracy. It's the least evil thing that we have. It's bad, but not as bad as everything else we've tried. Kind of an answer. And so I don't know if there would be any overall advantage to adopting your language. It would start from just a neutral ground and then become essentially synonymous with what we see as success, because the current model of success is what happens to benefit society the most.
Yeah. So I would clarify. So I don't think capitalism as such is dangerous. It's just an economic theory. The fact is that it has given rise to a very particular ideology relative to human meaning and relative to the importance of human voices and which voices matter and which bodies count.
Well, do you think that's specifically to do with capitalism? Because I think that's more human nature, and it applies to every single economic or political theory. There leads to be something synonymous where there's one group of people who are seen as better and in control and more significant. And so I don't see that as unique to capitalism. That seems to be more like a human nature kind of a thing.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure where we could stand to talk about human nature except within our current social and political structures. So I would say the way we make sense of human nature as that, as you described, certainly reflects the capitalistic insight that winners come at the cost of losers, and winning is better, and therefore the winners are those who are given social power. So I would say,
what is wrong with that assessment?
It's only a model of how to make sense of human social interaction. It's entirely plausible to understand more of a Levinasian or Derridian model of human social life that would say, how can we see the other as implicating me in obligation from the outset, that my identity is not self-interested but other-oriented? And this would cause radical revisions. Again, it may not get rid of capitalism, but it would require us to rethink the goals of capitalism. Or
so my initial thought is that the capitalistic principle that you describe seems to just describe nature and the limited fact of resources. A lion's success is a gazelle's failure or cost. The success of the lion is going to affect the life of the gazelle in a negative way. And so the success of one country gaining power is necessarily going to cause another country to lose something because they're going to have less resources, less military might, whatever. It doesn't seem possible, given our current, the way nature operates, to have a system that is mutually beneficial in every way. It seems like there's necessarily going to be conflicting somethings, whether resources, air, pollution, externalities, and one person's gain is going to be another person's loss necessarily, just because of the limited resources fact of nature.
Yeah, so I think there's a conflation of two different notions of limitation. So yes, there is a limit to the amount of natural resources that our Earth can provide. That yields a problematic sense of zero-sum games in lots of situations. But it's also the case that we could think about gain in different ways. So again, this is part of what faithfulness for me encourages. It's saying, hey, the goal is not to win at this. The goal is to be ever more invested in something that we think is worthwhile. And so if I'm going to say, like Derrida, well, maybe what it means to be truly just is to realize that you're never just enough. And to be democratic means that you've got to be welcoming even to the enemies of democracy, which is a radical claim, such that we gain by creating opportunities for others to gain. that this mutuality of respect and dignity in the context of limited resources also then can allow innovation not to be something that models profit margins, but innovation in a way to create maximal distribution of the public good. So again, it's not that I'm disagreeing with your account of human nature. I might be, but it's more that I'm just saying the contexts in which, back to your question, so hey, why does this get us anything? Aren't we just changing contingent linguistic structures? And my response is, yeah, that's all we ever do. Right? Contingent linguistic structures create opportunities for human flourishing or human embodied suffering. And so it seems to me that when some words, as Martin Heidegger puts it, no longer can be used productively, we need to look around for different words. Now, it may be that the better strategy is no, this word needs rethought, right? And so I'm taking the risk of saying, yeah, faith carries a lot of baggage, but it's also anchored in this Latin notion of pistis, which has to do with trusting. And I think that in a context of lost social trust, because of the absolute assholes that have been running our country and eliminating the good and dignity of all of these human others, right? When that's our structure, I'm willing to try to rethink and anchor meaning in terms of faithfulness and trust rather than terms of success, which I think are precisely used by the assholes to motivate their significance. I recognize that these are both contingent spaces and it could be otherwise. But given that this is where we find ourselves, when Trump could say, I'm really rich, that's one of the greatest things about me, we as a culture should say, no, we're calling bullshit. That's an irrelevant thing about you relative to meaning, goodness, and human leadership capacity. It just means you got a bunch of stuff, man. Now, we all can have goals to have a bunch of stuff. I'm not critical of that desire, though I think that it is unfortunate when it becomes unitary. But hey, if your goal is to have a bunch of stuff, cool, go do you. But recognize that that's going to come at some other costs. There are risks involved. So for me, it's not about replacing success with faithfulness in some sort of natural kind. It's instead to say, look, what's likely to gain traction in the lives of people who are currently the audience? And what I'm finding is success narratives are already interpreted in terms of money, achievement, and embodiment of historical power. And so I'm trying to create spaces where historically marginalized people of color, underrepresented groups, that this can be something where we say, look, it's not about success. We need to create material opportunities for success for all the people. But let's do that in a way where success itself can be, somebody says, I need to make better use of the word narrative. In continental philosophy, everything is narrative. Everything is a story used by someone to benefit or to lose. And that's why, for me, thinking about narrative, who is benefited with our current usage of the success narrative? And it ain't the poor, right? Like they're not getting better. But we who are middle class or whatever might think, I'm better when I recognize the faithfulness of the poor getting up every day to create opportunities for meaning for them and the people they love. That should wreck my account of myself as somehow more significant or more important because of my successes. Man, maybe in fact, in that sense, I'm not much of a success at all because I've got a new car in the driveway, but I don't have, in fact, a heart broken for the injustice that continues to infect our world. Right. So in that sense,
so I just wanted to jump in.
It's worthwhile.
So I just want to jump in there and say, like, to me, it seems like the reason we value money is related to something like the labor theory of value, where money is a representation of work that can be done. And the reason we care about work that can be done is because it's what affects us the most. So I think that it makes sense to measure success or meaning, or whichever word you want to use, based on what is the most likely resource to be able to affect your life and the lives of others. So if you can translate work into some like a gun or a spear or something, or military might, and that military might can affect everyone around you, then it doesn't matter who has the most air or water or land. If you have a gun, you can take all of it and there's nothing they can do to stop you. And so the most valuable resource in that society is the gun. And so what we care about, what we would measure money in, is units of gun, whatever. Like, remember the Mad Max thing where oil is or gas is the most precious resource, and so they measure
or
things
water world, right? If you can find a little ounce of earth, you're in good shape. Yeah,
exactly. And so it seems like it's rational to measure success in terms of whatever resource can have the most impact on your life. And that's why I think we measure it in terms of money, because money is a representation of work and what has the most impact in our life, how we can move matter from one location to another in the most effective way possible.
Right.
And I don't think changing that to a different theory of value would be better, because I think the most accurate theory of value is one that measures it based off of the thing that can do the most to change people's lives, which is work and money, not necessarily morality. So I agree that your model is more moral, 100%. I'm in full agreement that we should be able to have this kind of utopian idea where everyone should be able to get along, and that should be the end goal, that what we should be working for. But the question is does valuing that end goal produce a better outcome, or does valuing selfishness produce a better outcome? And by better, I mean closer to the utopian outcome. So if valuing selfishness and having selfishness be the motivation for people actually led to something closer to the utopia than valuing the utopia itself, then I would say the valuing of the utopia was actually a bad thing. And what matters more is the outcome, which is closer to the utopia, and therefore changing the value structure, the value words of the individuals isn't a good thing in that case. Kind of like the argument against socialism, that when countries adopt socialism, millions of people die. Even if they have the most moral intentions, the outcomes themselves are less moral.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important point, because one of the dangers with philosophy as such is we live and work in realms created by words and ideas that may or may not ever get instantiated, right? I mean, when you're comfortable with possible world semantics, it can be very tempting to say, well, look, I've quote unquote won some argument because, well, my possible world was more compelling than yours. And then I'm always struck by Martha Nussbaum, who said of Judith Butler, yeah, but look, rhetorical feminism is fine, but are you actually helping women in the world? Or Simone de Beauvoir says, I must ask daily whether I'm working for the liberation of my fellows, right? So I take this objection very seriously. And this can be hard to convince people of, but it's my motivation for all of this work is, in fact, that I do believe that when we look and we say, all right, the gun theory of value works really well to bring about certain types of ends, unless there's something about the gun theory itself that is going to corrupt those ends from the outset, right? So it's kind of like saying, well, the racist who accidentally ends up yielding some sort of outcome because they misunderstood the calculus, I would say, yeah, but if the racism is latent in the process, it's going to yield outcomes that will eventually be problematic, even if they look good. And so in the same way, for me, I would want to say, look, part of why I'm not saying overcome capitalism, I'm saying overcome the narrative of capitalism as success relative to money, is because I actually think there are really, really important goods. When capitalism, as my friend Aaron James wrote a great book called Assholes and another great book called Surfing with Sartre, what he suggests is, look, if we're going to think really well about capitalism as, you know, the rising tide lifts all ships, that's a really good thing. And so if focusing on money as meaning maker lifts all ships, I'm in. But what the history of the last 50 years has shown is it doesn't lift all ships. It really elevates yachts and swamps the dinghies, says Aaron, right? So the reality is not that the structures we have in place are all bad all the time. It's a matter of saying, but they're not necessary. They are, as you said, contingent. Things could be otherwise. So I don't like the word utopian because I think it can sometimes mean impossible pie in the sky. But it actually in Greek just means utopos. It just says there is no place from which one can stand to instantiate this fully. That seems right. I'm absolutely utopian if it means the goals toward which we strive are not goals to be achieved on some date, but goals that are worth our finitude. And in that sense, yeah, let's find a way to do that sort of work. So I would say, well, Gandhi accomplished a whole lot, but did it in a very different model. King, again, his model was not a money model, but it needed money to work. Yeah, because we still live in a society where money is what buys you access. So I'm not suggesting abandon this and, drop out of college and run off to some sort of farm. My suggestion is whatever you think matters, let's just recognize that that's the good. We're trying to empower people to be, as Nietzsche says, possessed of their own will. But when you are possessed of your own will, that means that we've got to take seriously that your will is implicated in the flourishing wills of others. So I don't have to not be an egoist, right? I'm not trying to say necessitate someone abandoning selfishness. I am suggesting selfishness right now is celebrated as just a necessary evil to be successful. And I want to say, no, maybe it's just evil. Like maybe that's just bad. And when we think about who are you becoming someone defined by selfishness? That might be something that we then, just like TikTok fads, why don't we have a fad that says, yeah, like I don't want to live that sort of life. And let's create a sort of public engagement that says, hey, maybe risk yourself in a direction that's a little bit more compelling, right? Just don't be impressed by the new Porsche, though it's cool. If anybody wants to send me one, happy to take it. But the idea is that doesn't make me better, make the world better. I like it. And that's cool. And that's fine. And we can celebrate that. But faithfulness is bigger than that. Faithfulness is not about religion, but it is possibly religious. That's an option for people, just like non-religious faithfulness is possible too.
So my objection would be maybe the Porsche does make the world a better place. So when you say that the gun theory itself will corrupt something, the outcomes, and you use the example of racism, to me, I don't see a connection between those two things. So suppose somebody is racist, a racist president of the United States or something. So he thinks African Americans are less capable than white people or something. And so he decides to invest a significant more money into welfare, Social Security, affirmative action, and housing for minorities because he thinks they're less capable. And so we just need to do everything we can to just do all of it for them. Now, this would improve the lives of all minorities significantly, even though he was inherently racist in his motivations. And so I don't think that there's a connection between the intention of the individual necessarily corrupting the outcome. I don't think those two are tied together. And so it can be the case that there are people who are, or what we would see as negative values theory of what their motivations are, but it leads to objectively better, more moral worlds that they have these immoral values. So I don't see that there's a connection between having immoral values leading to an immoral world, or that there's this inherent corruption between the values and the outcomes. And so when I look at the world, I see a lot of immoral things that lead to moral things. Kind of like the racist example, the racist president who wants to give healthcare to people who he thinks are less capable or whatever. Right. It seems to me that valuing capitalism and seeing the Porsche as valuable motivates people in such a way that it leads to a better world. than people who want to think in the utopia. And I agree, utopias are achievable. I have a best of all possible worlds model, which I think is achievable. So I wouldn't say utopias are unachievable, but it seems to me that people who center around the idea of success and money and Porsches as a ideology that motivates is a way to get people to build societies that are more moral, even if the values aren't more moral. And I don't see any reason to believe that having more moral values would lead to a more moral society. And we have this really successful model. Capitalism works, supports billions of people all around the world. They're not starving to death, which is a huge improvement over 300, 400 years ago.
Yep.
And so I don't think it's a wise strategy to mess with that system, which we already know works. It would be like if we can build a new system and show that it works better on some independent frame of reference, then yeah, okay, then we can now start to like transition over. But until that happens, I don't think it's fair to say that this system we have is able to be criticized in that way, because it is the most successful model we have. And I don't see your model as being able to compare to the level of success that this gun theory of value works at.
Yeah. So again, I'm not trying to suggest that capitalism as an economic theory is necessarily something to overcome, right? In fact, in my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, I don't talk about economics at all, because again, it's not about here's this better model of human economic exchange and here's a better way to distribute goods, etc. Now I'm pretty far left, right? So I hold progressivist social values.
Clarify. Yeah, we're talking about the value system of the individuals that lead to this system. And so I'm thinking my argument is the value system of that led to capitalism, even though it entails some immoral values, I still think that might be better than a value system that has a more moral grounding.
Well, no, I'm with you entirely, except that last sentence, and I just don't know yet. So if we're going to, again, not confuse, which is tricky, capitalism is an economic theory, but as I've been using it, you're exactly right. It's a system of value that says a particular mode of meaning making relative to what we've narrated as a contingent social history called success, right? Which is basically anchored in a monetary notion of value, that itself is something that we could absolutely agree and say, hey, but what motivates this is really good and it's something to support. And I actually don't disagree. I am what sort of technically would be called, a sort of leisure capitalist, is a term that is thrown out there a lot, where the goal of capitalism, I want to suggest, is not to make more money, though that might be your goal or my goal. Again, individuals can pursue money as their leisure, and that's good. But the goal of capitalism should be human thriving and flourishing to the point where time and our own finitude is the good that we gain by participating in this social behavior. And right now, what we've got is only the wealthy are able to participate in that model of finitude being their own property, right? And so my critique of capitalism is not a critique of a particular economic model, but it's saying, hey, these values, rising tides lift all ship, this is what leads to leisure, as it did, in the Roaring 20s, right? Leisure became more available to more people. This is all a good. But what we've seen over the last 70, 80 years is we haven't made good on that value that actually anchored lots of capitalism. And I think one of the ways that we now see it is workaholic mentalities, students that are so anxious and threatened with despair and all kinds of crises that I deal with every single day in my classes. These are not going away because capitalism has been successful. They're, I think, getting exacerbated in part by the fact that students coming in 16, 17 years old already have to know what they're going to do. And the reason they're doing it is it provides money, which allows them to be able to have a particular model of the American dream. And part of the distaste and reaction against that, right, as we see, on the so-called critiques of millennials, right, the kind of checking out and getting lazy and stuff, I actually don't see it that way at all. It's just, how is it we can find our footing in a context that has said all that matters about you is your ability to be socially important on a value set that we reject. And that doesn't mean we have to leave capitalism. It does mean, I think, we've got to rethink the values by which capitalism is currently enacted. And that doesn't necessarily mean changing our economic theory. It does mean changing our narrative about the stuff that we are jealous of, right? Like, what would it look like to say, man, I am not jealous of my friend's mansion or his Porsche, right? Though, again, I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing for him to have. Have what you want to have, man. But why is it I should have some sort of social impetus to think that that's the goal, when in fact, maybe the goal is to be able to spend more time camping with my family, or just spend more time at home for dinner, or spend more time. Last night, my son, my dad is a artist and does ceramics. And so my son and my dad did some ceramics a few weeks ago. We needed to fire them in a kiln. We don't have a kiln. My dad's retired. So we built a kiln out of stone in my backyard, and last night fired the pots. That didn't work because the clay wasn't low fire and it was a disaster, but we learned something and it was awesome. We had the night together because I wasn't having to work last night to make sure I could pay the bill for next week. So the point is, faithfulness is not something opposed to achieving goals. It's just saying maybe we should rethink what goals are worthy of our lives. Money, important, necessary, right? I'm going to fight like cats and dogs to help my students get good jobs, but I'm going to fight harder to make sure they don't think their job defines their dignity. Because when they lose their job, now they're unable to navigate the realities of the human condition. When they lose that Porsche, they somehow think that they're not important, that they don't matter. When they don't get the A in the class and they suddenly think, well, now why keep going? Or they're tempted to do things that are immoral relative to success. Maybe I'll cheat. Maybe I'll take some drugs. Maybe I'll get different access. I think we can create a social structure nested in the idea that we are all faithful. We're all doing the best we can. And now we're going to celebrate that and make that the thing we are focused on. And so for me, why I want to go in my book camping with Kierkegaard is because not Kierkegaard was a good camper. Dude would have been horrid in the woods. He was melancholic and did not like going for long walks and was generally a miserable human, according to all accounts. I don't want to go camping literally with him. But what he does say is, hey, what can we learn from the lilies of the field and the birds of the air about silence and joy? Well, maybe that's something we can learn. He says purity of heart is to will one thing. Now, I think he's wrong. We will all kinds of things. But it's important to say, but what am I willing in a way that makes me someone I'm okay being? Rather than defining ourselves. We have a crisis right now of, teen girls in particular, but teens in general, of re-narrating who they are in light of whatever TikTok fad is occurring and how many social media followers they have at like 12, right? So what if we said instead, hey, it's not that that's bad. Social media is awesome. Let's get good at it. But how can we invite each other to be more invested in our personhood, in becoming a self? That, I think, contributes to the very thing I know you are so good at, inviting people into conversations that matter in light of truth that does impact our shared existence. That's a faithful life to me. That seems
for
right.
me, the question is where is the evidence that this value system actually leads to a better society? Because when I look at it, I think about religion. As an atheist, I obviously think religion is false. But in the past development of human history, religion has done a very good job at orienting people to live better lives, to have better societies, to do less crime. There's also some bad things they do, like the Crusades, the witch hunts, etc. And so there's a collection
and perfectionism. Just to add that, right? I think perfectionism in the sense of, hey, you can be perfect. And if something's wrong with you, it's because you're far from God. I think that narrative is also desperately problematic relative to the way we understand religious trauma. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and the heaven to hell
Yeah.
mentality has given people both motivation in that it gets them trying to act in a certain way, not eat pork or whatever, which saved millions of people from trichinosis hundreds of years ago, but also traumatizes them into being terrified of going to hell and disobeying God and whatever.
Yeah.
So there's both positives and negatives to this ideology, which I think is completely false. Obviously, I think it's completely fabricated. But having this ideology objectively led to more positive things than it did negative things. I think from an evolutionary standpoint, it was very successful. And so it's overall was a benefit that was better than other ideologies at the time. And so I think I see capitalism in the same respect. I see it as, yes, it obviously leads to a lot of negative things like the stress of students and workaholicism and alcoholism and materialism of just valuing money. But it also has led to greater prosperity than ever before. So I disagree where you said that I don't see these things as increasing due to capitalism. I actually see them as decreasing due to capitalism. I think that the stress level of students today is far lower than it was during the Black Plague. I think that the stress level of people during the Black Plague was probably more than students going to college and knowing what their career plans have to be. And so this hyper focus on money and being jealous of a guy's Porsche, I think is similar to a hyper focus on God and going to heaven. There are many negatives, but there are also many positives. And the question I would need answered is, obviously there's going to be infinitely many ideologies that could potentially exist. And we would need to show that for any given ideology, it would produce a better outcome for society than the one we're currently using. Now I can definitely say the value structure of capitalism is bad, obviously, but I don't really care about the value structure. I care about the outcomes. And so of any value structure, whether or not it's a more moral system than capitalism, I don't think is a meaningful comparison. I don't really care. What I care about is, if a society adopts this value structure, will it lead to a better society? Is there any evidence that the value structure you're proposing will actually lead to a better outcome?
So, though I would not reject all conceptions of moral consequentialism, I do think that it's only part of a more complicated sort of moral pluralist theory that I would defend. So just saying it doesn't matter except the outcome, I would say, well, no, there's all kinds of situations where outcomes can be good, and yet what underwrite it, again, not just bad intentions, but it also might be contagions right underneath it that lead then to bad outcomes further down the road past the good outcomes. And so I think it's just got to be the case that we recognize virtue is something not reducible to a philosophic calculus, that motivation is bigger.
Something's coming in my head, sir. So you said there could be contagions that could lead to further consequences down the road.
So, for example,
global warming.
That'd be a good one. I was thinking of the conspiracy theories articulated right now in America, right? So, if we were to say
wanted to ask quick, because if your ideology was adopted, is there any reason to think yours wouldn't also have the same contagions that we just don't know about? Like, I don't see the fact that obviously any ideology could lead to some kind of unknown thing that destroys the planet and we have no idea. Say like we value AIs or something, or we value food. Say we value food a lot. We want to feed everyone to 100% so that there's zero starvation. And so we genetically modify food, but then it ends up eating up all the nutrients in the soil and we all starve to death. So the greatest motivation possible could have a contagion that could lead to some unknown consequence in the future, but that seems to apply to every ideology. So I don't see why that would be a reason to prioritize yours over capitalism, because the evidence still seems to say that the capitalistic model is less likely to have those because it's worked thus far. And I don't see any reason to think that your model would have lesser severe contagions if it was adopted. So I still don't see that as a relevant objection to answer the question of why we should adopt yours over capitalism, or why the looking at the moral consequences isn't what should matter here. I don't understand how that could be a valid objection.
Yeah. So when you say capitalism, again, for me, I keep pushing back, and I know you're using it in a technical sense that I'm okay with. But for listeners, it's not that I'm saying let's get rid of capitalism. I'm saying let's get rid of a value theory that anchors meaning and dignity in terms of market capitalization, right? And so we could say shorthand, the current value set of capitalism is that assholes are a necessary part of having global success lift. And I'm saying, well, no, assholes are assholes, and we should fight to create a society with less assholes. That may or may not mean that we rethink market structures, but it definitely is going to mean we rethink what we're willing to accede to and accept relative to social behavior in relation to those outcomes, right? So I would just say, I think that there's too rigid a dichotomy between, well, but this thing called capitalism with all its assholes yields all this good. I'm saying, well, economic structures that prize innovation and freedom are likely to lead to good outcomes. But what they've also done is created a structure where corporate interests now get to dictate my student's identity. And that model has then bled into our political structures, where the powerful and the assholes become the same person, right? So you end up then needing to create I'm trying to not use the word narrative anymore, since your viewers made me nervous about it, has created a story that we tell that will try to create all the people abused by the system to rally behind the powerful assholes in the name of their own good, right? But in fact, what they're doing is being disempowered from the realization that they don't have to live in a world defined according to assholery.
Well, yeah, I agree with all of that, but it's kind of like an ant colony. If you have an ant colony and all the worker ants work together, you get this beautiful little, this massive structure that works really well. But if all the ants go and do their own thing, you get no structure. All the ants die. And so even though I agree with everything you said there, I didn't hear why getting rid of the assholes would be good. I need evidence that an asshole or less assholes in power would produce a better society. Because I understand in principle it sounds better because we don't like assholes, but I don't see any evidence that a non-asshole society or a less asshole society would actually work. I would need this model to be implemented in a society, look at the outcome of the society, be like, oh, it's working. Until then, the asshole society supports billions of people, and this hypothetical society hasn't been tested yet.
Yeah, no, look, and I think this is a entirely reasonable objection. But let's take one step back and remember what I'm arguing for. So we've kind of gotten in the weeds rather than the sort of forest that ultimately is what I'm interested in describing, right? The continental philosophy that I do is trying to say, hey, forest dwellers, there's another forest. It could, there's other trees that we could plant. And so then one of the temptations that sometimes can cause us to resist the realization that there is another forest that could be planted is the fact, but there's an effing elm tree in front of me. Elms are better than hickory. You're like, yeah, but maybe we have a forest that everything is, redwoods. So I take your objection and I'm going to respond to it best I can. But I do want to at least mark the fact, like somebody said here, but we need more quantitative data. I was like, or we need to recognize, I'm a fan of quantitative data. Believe me, I've got booster. My son just got it. Thank you, science, for helping us not die from the pain. All in on, we need quantitative data. But we also need to recognize that the name we give to quantitative data as objective is itself a particular narrative, and there's that word again, by which we empower certain practices as more important and more beneficial than others. And I would just suggest, look, when we are saying, but how would this model of faithfulness be better than a model of success? What I'm wanting to say back is, well, what do we mean by better? And as soon as we start articulating better, my hunch is, and it's kind of already started happening, we articulate a society that looks more like a society where everybody is faithful than a society where everybody's just trying to check boxes and be successful and screw the other person. So when you said, hey, yeah, there's all these assholes, but it still leads to really good stuff. And I'm saying, yeah, but you don't have to always be a consequentialist, right? There's more good than consequences, but let's talk about those consequences. It has helped people get out of poverty. It's allowed people to have more leisure. It's provided different types of freedoms. It's
people
provided
not starving to death
in all sorts of spaces, right? Used to be the case just 10, 15 years ago, more than 30,000 kids a day were dying of preventable disease relative to starvation, right? That number has gone down significantly. These are all good things, but notice when we start articulating those goods, I want to suggest we're already thinking about what kind of people do we want to be? We want to be the kinds of people who live in a world where our food is not coming at the cost of someone's starvation. We want to be the type of people who live in a world where my success doesn't come at the cost of the bodily integrity of someone else, where my freedom doesn't come at the cost of reproductive rights for somebody else, right? The ability to think about what it is our goods really are, I want to suggest is already latently endorsing, hey, we need a different model of what it is we're inviting people to love and care about. Now, my suggestion is not come to my classes in philosophy. I'm going to teach you what to love. Hell no. What I'm going to do, I hope, is make you recognize the responsibility of being a lover, right? So whatever you choose to love, love it well. Do it on purpose. And that model, I really do think, is one that gets us away from, practical example, anybody who's gone on a college admission tour, you know, their version of you're saying, yes, but what are the outcomes? What's the data? Their version of it is, we'll prepare you for the real world, right? That's their, you know, their articulated t-shirt version of our data proves that our students are successful. We give you experiences that prepare you for the real world. What Socrates, Aristotle, Confucius, Descartes, James Cone, all the way up, right? What Maya Angelou, all of the great thinkers in human history have invited us to realize is there is no real world that is not a product of someone else's decision about how to make a world real. That's faithfulness. So I do want to train my students in real world practices. I want them to all take personal finance classes because I think it's important. They should learn that stuff. I want them to be able to have the ability to navigate the world responsibly given the way the world is when they find it. But I think I have failed them if I've not invited them to recognize the world could be otherwise. And what we do with our finitude is ultimately not just prepare for the real world, but it's actively contribute to what world will be made real for others. That faithfulness is a task for a lifetime. It's not something we finish on a Tuesday. It's not something that's going to unite you and I and 5 others all on the same moral principles. We can really disagree about the moral principles that motivate us then to become the selves we want to be. But we're all invested in the task of self-becoming. And that idea that it's not a list of to do, but it's a list of to be as I keep ever practicing. That I think is important, and it's not one that we are celebrating in the right ways. So when I tell people I love fishing, you better believe I hope to catch fish when I go fishing, right? But if you said, well, what's the goal of fishing? I genuinely would not say the goal of fishing is to catch fish. That's a thing I want. I hope it occurs. It's a desire. But the goal of fishing is to be someone who has navigated life such that fishing is a frequent part of it. Why do I fish? So I can keep fishing. That idea invites us to be invested in what it is that matters, why it is we do it, and is it something we want to keep doing? And I just don't think that's the story that we are selling to people when we give them clear binary options. So you want to major in business or pre-med, or you want to be broke, right? The amount of parents who come and say, what are you doing? My student wants to major in philosophy over my dead body, right? Because we've given them a
Sounds like a smart parent.
We've given them a world that is those values that say you don't matter unless you look, act, behave like this. And then again, none of this has to be understood Christianly, though I personally do. This is good Nietzscheanism, right? He throws up when everybody comes running after him trying to decide how to do the world. He says, no, the point is not follow my path. It's follow your own and be willing to become who you are by leaving the cities and trekking in high mountains. God is dead, he says, only if we eventually kill grammar, which is a hell of a claim. What's he mean? We've got to recognize even grammatical structures are contingent social realities that could be otherwise. And that's what faithfulness to me is all about, is undertaking that responsibility. Do I hope that it leads us in a broadly leftist sort of direction? Yeah. Do I hope that it leads to more equality and more engagement and less assholes? Hell yes, I do. But whatever it leads to, I hope it doesn't just make us into calculating machines relative to the cost-benefit analysis of personal benefit that is then articulated in terms of money. And I'm okay saying that risk is worth taking.
And from my perspective, I'm taking it from the consequentialist approach. I mean, I like the way it sounds, but obviously I like my own ideology and I'd like everyone to adopt it, but I'm too afraid to implement that, whether yours or mine or anybody's, because I think the outcomes matter more than the simplicity or beauty or morality of a particular value system.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wouldn't mess with the programming, the values, because of the outcome it may have on society is unknown. And so before I would endorse a particular set of value structure, I would want to know what outcome it has. And if simply making people deluded slaves led to a world where there was less hunger and death and starvation, then I would choose that route, because I think the consequences matter more than the value structure that people have.
So that claim, I believe you. So I don't think you're being disingenuous. I think, yeah, I fundamentally would just come down differently there. But part of, again, what I mean by faithfulness as a way of life is, I think you and I can both be faithful to those directions in opposite ways, right? So I wouldn't say, oh, you are not faithful. I'd say, no, the direction of your risk is a consequentialist outcome guided by certain sorts of visions for social progress. Cool. I can disagree with you about the social progress. I can disagree with you about the consequentialist moral theory that underlies it. But what I want to celebrate is, hey, Tom is a guy who's invested in living on purpose in a direction that he's able to articulate and move toward. I don't think that is something that we make possible for most people. I think we actively eliminate what I would describe as that fundamental philosophical invitation. So I don't want to make people professional philosophers, though I think it's kind of cool. But like, again, that's a really bad practical strategy for life.
Destroy society overnight.
Not a good idea. Like, do not vote for philosophers for Congress, right? We are disasters, or ever put us on juries. Like, I can't imagine anybody, beyond a reasonable doubt, like, wait a minute.
I don't know if you murdered that guy. I mean, we could be a brain in the vat. Like,
it's possible that, right? It's a disaster. But nonetheless, I'm so committed to the idea that philosophy is a good way of life, whether we are mechanics or physicians or technical workers or Amazon delivery people. We should be invited to philosophy as a way of life. And what I'm trying to name that invitation is faithfulness, because I think there's historical reason for it. I saw somebody else saying, why is this being called faithfulness? And somebody else said, I heard everything you said and I don't know. Eventually, I think we've got to be careful about a willed obstinacy. I said at the beginning, faith is not what we mean relative to religious belief because we don't have good evidence. Faith is risk with direction. Then you say, but what direction? And I say, that's a matter of existential investment. Who do you want to become? And ultimately, the risk that we take is that it doesn't lead you where you hope to go. The outcomes go disastrously wrong. I recognize when I take my son mountain biking, something could go bad. He fell today, messed up his wrist a little bit, but he was fine. It could have gone much worse. I also recognize that I'm willing to take that risk. And that's where my cost benefit analysis comes. Does he have a good helmet? Do we have good pads? Have I got him a good bike? Am I riding trails that I know are not over technical, right? So I've already done all the things that are part of the cost benefit relative to just risk and outcome of not getting injured. But riding with my son, finding an activity that is my time with him is what I'm invested in, whether we are riding or playing in the backyard or just having a conversation. That's the ultimate risk and direction. It might be the case that we picked the wrong activity and it leads to injury, and that sucks. I don't think I would have failed at faithfulness. I think I just will regret the fact that, shoot, I shouldn't have taken that drop so quickly, right? But those are two different levels at which faithfulness plays out. And in a time of rampant loss of social trust, rampant despair, which, believe me, I wrestled with a lot during COVID, and because of my embodied privilege in the world as a white Christian heterosexual middle-class person, it caused me more despair to think about the fact that it took a pandemic to let me see half of that despair, where embodied persons looking different than me have lived with this every single day of their lives. Suddenly, the frame cracked, right? Not just in my life, but I think what the pandemic did is it caused, as we saw, the Great Resignation. People saying, I don't want to do this anymore. Even people making tons of money and being successful. You know what? Suddenly I was able to spend time with my family, and I'm not willing to give that back up. Or, wow, I don't have to take a 2-hour commute because I could do it at home. We saw the opportunity to provide people with real agency relative to life direction. And sadly, that's something that then we don't do a good enough job of expanding globally and recognizing, wow, but we live in a society that made it possible on our computers and fast internet and stuff to do that. Whereas lots of developing nations haven't even gotten the first dose of vaccine yet. Right. And we're throwing it away every day because we got so much. So when we start realizing, how do we invite everyone who are equally morally dignified to be possessed of the same agency relative to their direction? Maybe that's something that we need to name. And for me, when I grope for how to name that, it's a matter of trust, it's a matter of hope, and it's a matter of faith, all in light of risk and purpose. And so that's why the word is the best one that I've been able to come up with. And to be honest, I think it also does subversive work in trying to critique the white evangelical Christian nationalism bullshit that says faith over fear is just a way of ignoring science, right? And saying, oh, you think that's faith? Right? Nah, that's not faith. That's just ideological subservience. Let's actually look at what real faith might involve, and it's a lifetime of existential investment. And at that level, it's not getting away from quantitative data. It's saying, now let's go talk to sociologists and anthropologists and the people who really can then help us think about which directions are better directions. But I see that as a second order conversation, right? Now let's go talk to historians who can talk to us about the dangers of authoritarianism rearing its head. Let's talk to people who are looking at the workings of conspiracy theory and ideological harm that we are facing daily, so we can realize, oh, so certain phrases and certain words are in fact better to create certain types of outcome. Then I'm with you. I'm a consequentialist. But my consequentialism is because I think we are not reducible to consequences and we are not reducible to numbers. There is something about us in the shared human condition that invites us to recognize, in the face of despair, it is possible yet to hope. And trust is something that requires more of us than good arguments. It also requires, as we say on mountain bike, right? At a certain point, you've done all the work, and then you got to send it. And you've got to hope that your bike doesn't break, and you've got to hope that you move your body in the right way, and you hope that that rock doesn't give out. But you got to send it. And ultimately, all of us are sending it. I just think, unfortunately, too many of us are riding on bikes built by others. And the trust we have for them is trust that is deeply misplaced, because their self-interest and their assholery and their profit margins are trying to make sure that we're riding bikes that do nothing but advertise for their company.
Yeah, so I understand your position pretty well, but I think that my initial question is probably my biggest concern is why call it faithfulness. It seems like you're taking a word that already has a really well established definition for the vast majority of people and changing its meaning in a, obviously I would say in a more rational way. I think that the current usage of faith is not very rational. It's like the opposite of rationality going. I think you should proportion your beliefs to the evidence, and faith is going beyond that. So I would agree that there are more rational ways to use the word, but I think given that because the word already has such a profound usage and understanding for the vast majority of people, using faithfulness essentially just confuses people because they think you mean something different than what you actually mean. And so that's the difficulty when trying to really redefine already accepted words.
Yeah, it's a risk. I also think, and this I might be so wrong on, but again, it's a a risk I'm willing to take right now. We'll see, when I finish this book, if I get refuted enough and I say, all right, I'm going to try something else. But to play your consequentialist game really intentionally for a second, I genuinely believe within American politics, right? And again, I've been trying to think in a global sense relative to the human condition, but in a very local sense of American political life, I do not see a way forward that is celebrating, put it in the broader context, the arts and humanities and meaning making as valuable in these big senses. I don't see a way forward for that, for philosophy programs, right, as celebrated alongside nursing programs and pharmacy schools, which again, God bless all of them. This is not a comparative. It's just saying they all matter. The only way I see us doing that is if we start making inroads into, broadly speaking, white working class, largely evangelical spaces.
Well, I would think more like once we get artificial intelligence and it does all the real work, then we can all do what we want.
There is definitely an alternative future tree here, yes. But I really like climate change. We can't address climate change with Joe Manchin holding the views he holds. He holds the views he holds, not, and this is a weird way to put it because I disagree with him hardly, but I disagree with him heartily, sorry, that's the wrong word, is he's representing the people he represents, right? So in a weird way, it's like, that jackass. And yet it's like, no, he's doing exactly what candidates should do. He's representing where his people are, which is West Virginia. Like, it's not a big proactive environmental space, right? The problem is we can't change Joe Manchin unless we're somehow making inroads in those spaces, and lots of really good groups on the ground are doing that. Christian for the Mountains is a group based in West Virginia doing amazing stuff relative to mountaintop removal and the coal industry, talking about why there are good Christian reasons to be, for climate change addressing, right?
Advocacy.
Yeah, this is important. But unless we can speak to those spaces, I really think that what's going to happen is a continued further division where we're now just sort of, as Obama put it, which I thought was exactly right, though he got grief, we cling to our God and our guns, right? Because, as you say, the gun theory works real well for a lot of people. So does the God theory. Works real well for a lot of people, especially when they are insularly surrounded by other God gun people. But for the left, hey, we just don't talk to those God gun people. And we get insular and we get indignant and we get frustrated and annoyed and can't imagine how anybody can live that way. And we go to our, fancy breweries and don't talk to them. And your work, which again, I am a fan of what your faithfulness looks like in public, which is, again, you and I disagree about lots of stuff. We haven't even scratched the surface. We haven't talked about God, right? But the point is, you're being faithful to try to say those enclaves are socially detrimental. Philosophy is a public good, and let's get good at it, right? And I think, yes, all day long. Hell's bells, let's do that. I think faithfulness as a word choice with all of the baggage it brings is maybe more likely to open spaces to find some readers in that group that I disagree with in ways that all of the relevant alternatives either wouldn't, or they might only in a way that doesn't also get at those fundamental religious commitments that require them to even rethink how they make sense of God and faith. And I think maybe that's worth doing, right? At least trying. It seems like that's worth doing.
I think that's a great answer. The trying to open inroads into other communities by using words that they can relate with is a very good reason to try to adopt or change a specific word usage, as opposed to just, I like the word and I think everyone should use it this way.
Well, and I also think, and this is a Sartrean point, it's a real attempt to say, hey, to people who are not classically understood as persons of faith, I'm wanting to say, what a bullshit notion of person of faith. We are all persons of faith because we are humans risking ourselves in existential directions. That's not patronizing. I'm trying to make you look like my Pentecostal sisterin and brethren. Hell no. I respect you too much, right? But I also think it sucks to act like, notice our phrases. If you're not a person of good faith, you're a person of bad faith. Well, that's already negatively overtoned, right? Mauvais foi was not a good thing for Sartre. Bad faith was a thing to overcome and avoid. But if the only good faith is a determinately religious instantiation of faithfulness, what we've actively done is described lots of people of good faith with whom one might disagree as being people of bad faith, which then leads to, in my opinion, real political exclusion, real ostracization, and even violent outcomes in lots of cases. And I want to say, no. I will stand with you as faithful over and against the white nationalist, quote unquote, religious believers who are claiming currently the word of faith. And I want to say, no, that actually is a failure of faith because it is nothing but corporate interest in conservative politics with a theological overlay. Screw that noise. But you and I can disagree faithfully. And that seems like something that makes the world at least oriented in the right direction. We'll see what happens. And that's where I want to have the sociologists and the anthropologists and the historians and the political scientists. Yeah, now they need to come economists, right? They can now come talk to us about, all right, on the ground then, which version of praxis? Am I a better father when I'm working harder to make more money for my son? Or I'm a better father recognizing it's not about money, it's about spending time with him, and I can maybe do one instead of the other. Like, those become different manifestations of shared faithfulness to being a good father. And that can look very, very, very differently. One of my best friends is an atheist philosopher who you may have read some of his books. But he and another friend of mine, Rob Talese and Scott Aiken, wrote a great book called The Reasonable Atheism, and highly recommend it. It's fantastic. I assign it in my classes. It's the best argument for atheism I've ever read in a compelling, clear way. And Scott and I were classmates at Vanderbilt with their PhDs. We shared an office together. He knew I was a Pentecostal Christian. I knew he was, an atheist. We are friends. We would lay in traffic for each other. And at one point, I remember saying to him, look, it's not that I know there's a God, but I hope reality looks a lot like Jesus. And that's why I continue to identify as Christian. And he said, I respect that. I hope reality looks a lot like the benign indifference described at the end of The Stranger. And at that moment, it was like, this is where then good conversations happen, not just about philosophy of religion, but about human life, is because we are both hopeful. We are both faithful. We are both trusting the best we can. And we can do arguments. We're both pros at this. That's fine. But what matters, it wasn't I know something and he's wrong, or he knows something and I'm wrong. It's no, the orientation of our direction is different, but our faithfulness is in play in both directions. And that seems entirely right, and something I'm going to say I think is pro-democracy. And it's in deep need in a society defined by conspiracy theories, assholes, and, corporate interests. So.
Yeah, gotcha. I think that's it for most of my questions about that. I think
Cool.
I definitely like your answer about the why, the faithfulness. That makes a lot of sense. But we've been going for about an hour and a half.
This has been great
conversation. Really appreciate
it. Really was. I appreciate you and what you're doing and your audience. I've been reading all the comments coming up, and clearly I've been less compelling to most of them, but maybe upon reflection, it'll at least make some inroad, and they can think with me. And again, I encourage them to check out my Philosophy Before We Find Ourselves YouTube channel. Very, very little explicitly religious content. It's more about trying to invite folks to see philosophy where we are in daily life, and maybe put stuff in practice in existentialism on the ground. So I have been honored to be with you, and hope it has been helpful to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great having you on. And I was going to ask if you wanted to give links to your channel, but you already covered that part. So already good. So definitely assign your class this lecture. That'll be awesome. Watch this show.
This would be awesome. Well, and again, I'm going to push this on my stuff because I think, in fact, when you invited me to be on, I said, well, my only stipulation was not to frame it as a debate and not use the word versus. And hopefully that now makes sense, right? It's because
it cost me at least 50 views. I could have just put debate versus destroys, and then I get extra 50 views.
I know. It's now, if you want to say, Tom and Aaron versus, success narratives or something, go ahead. But I just think that we've got a space where, we can take disagreement seriously. And by the way, I am on the left and don't think it's helpful to act like everything's okay and we all just agree and ain't it wonderful. And no, I don't take the Muslim seriously if I act like that, hey, we're believing the same stuff. It's like, no, I disagree with her. I disagree with him. But that disagreement doesn't necessitate then that I think she or he's going to hell. Part of why my theology has developed and why I'm a hopeful universalist and stuff is because I think the disagreements don't have those consequences, right? And so it's important that we recognize those of us celebrating philosophy don't have to do it in, combative ways, even when we are oppositionally directed. And that's why, for me, I love what you're doing, even though I come down differently on lots of stuff.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Well, I have to go to the bathroom, so
hey, this has been a thrill.
It was great having you on. Really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks so much. Take care.